welcome to the deep dive. You ready to jump into this? Today we're going to be looking at two platforms from the Republican Party, one from way back in 1968 and one from this year. It'll be interesting to see how their vision for America has changed over the decades.
Well, 1968 was quite a year, so it'll be a stark contrast to see how things have or haven't changed.
Definitely. So to get into it, we're going to be focusing on a few major things today. We'll be taking a close look at the GOP's stance on education, science, and the arts. Then we'll dig into this whole law and order thing that seems to be a recurring theme in their platforms. It'll be really interesting to see how their approach to all of it has changed over time. What do you think we should be paying attention to as we go through these platforms? What are some of the things that stand out to you?
Well, I think it's really interesting to pay attention to the language, like how they frame the challenges, who are they talking to, that kind of stuff. It's not just what they're saying, but why they're saying it that way, especially when you're looking at documents that are decades apart.
Okay, I'm ready to analyze this. Let's start with the 1968 platform. One of the things that really jumps out is the way it talks about the problems facing the nation. Poverty, racial injustice, urban decay. They don't shy away from these tough topics at all.
It is kind of shocking to see how upfront they are about these problems, right? They actually come right out and say it. For example, they talk about millions of Americans caught in the cycle of poverty, poor education, unemployment, or serious underemployment, and the inability to afford decent housing. And then they go on to describe inner cities as, get this, teeming with poor, crowded in slums. You don't see that kind of direct language very often in political platforms. It's almost like they're saying, hey, let's be real about the problems we're facing here.
I know, it's really striking. And it's surprisingly progressive, especially for a party that's often associated with a more, shall we say, hands-off approach.
Totally. Now, fast forward to the 2024 platform, and whoa, we see a very different picture, right?
Hit me with it. What's different?
Well, it's less about facing internal struggles and more about these big scary threats. They're really concerned about illegal immigration, the economy tanking, and what they call a weakened military. They're basically saying America's not as strong as it used to be, almost like we're under siege or something.
And it definitely has that whole Make America Great Again vibe to it, for sure.
Absolutely. They go so far as to say that, quote, previous politicians have destroyed our country. It's a complete 180 from what we saw in 1968, where they were calling for unity. Remember that line about working together in a vigorous effort nationwide?
So it's gone from let's fix this together to we need to save America from itself.
Yeah, it's quite the shift.
You could say that again. Speaking of shifts, let's talk about how they view education, science, and the arts. The 1968 platform goes into a surprising amount of detail about these topics. They even propose creating a national commission to study the quality of American education, which is kind of wild when you think about it.
Yeah, it's true. They dedicated a significant amount of space to education, science, and the arts, underlining how important they were for a strong and influential nation.
Right. They even talk about how important science and technology were. Makes sense, though, when you think about what was going on back then, the space race. It was a time of incredible progress in those areas. They definitely wanted to keep that momentum going.
Totally. Now compare that to the 2024 platform.
Crickets. It's like those topics just disappeared from the radar. Like someone was like, education, science, arts.
Yeah.
Hey, who needs them?
Well, it's not that they're not mentioned at all, but the focus has totally changed. Instead of investing in these areas, the 2024 platform talks about things like, parental rights and education, fighting what they call left-wing propaganda in schools, and, bringing back classic liberal arts education. They make education sound more like some kind of ideological battleground than anything else.
Wow, it's night and day compared to the 1968 platform. And speaking of big changes, what about how they approach urban and rural communities? That 1968 platform might surprise you on this one.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
They actually sound pretty progressive when it comes to cities. They're all about transforming rundown areas, turning them into thriving centers of opportunity and progress, culture even. It's like they actually want cities to be awesome places to live.
You're right. It's a really interesting approach. And it's not just cities either. They acknowledge the issues that both urban and rural areas face, from a lack of decent housing to limited transportation. And they specifically call out the need to help minority communities who they say, and I quote, suffer disproportionately.
So unlike some folks today, they weren't afraid to say that systemic issues are real. Now here's the million-dollar question. How different is their vision for cities in 2024?
Well, let's just say their tune has changed a bit. They still talk about rebuilding cities, But their main focus is on something else entirely: restoring law and order. It's almost like they're suggesting that cities are these hotbeds of crime and chaos now. The language is much more about control than revitalization this time around.
So we've gone from let's make cities awesome to let's crack down on cities.
Yeah,
What?
pretty much. And we haven't even gotten to the whole law and order section yet. That's a whole other can of worms. And believe me, it gets even more interesting.
Oh, I bet it does. I
Oh,
can't wait to dive into that. All right, let's dive into this law and order theme. It pops up in both platforms, but I have a feeling it doesn't mean the same thing in both contexts.
you're right. The meaning definitely shifts. In 1968, they connect law and order with the social and economic issues that lead to unrest. So, yeah, they call for firm and fair law enforcement, but they also talk about dealing with the root causes of crime, like poverty and discrimination.
So it's like, yeah, you need to enforce the law, but you also need to address why people might be breaking it in the first place.
Exactly. It's a much more nuanced view of the situation. But then we jump to the 2024 platform, and law and order takes on a much more aggressive, almost like urgent tone.
Yeah, it's definitely less about understanding the nuances and more about cracking down, I guess. What do you think caused that shift?
Well, they're definitely trying to make it seem like there's a much more serious threat now. Like they talk about a migrant crime epidemic, call for a massive deportation operation, even suggest using the military to deal with the cartels.
Wow, okay. So there's a much bigger focus on immigration and border security now. It's interesting how they connect that directly to crime and disorder.
Right. And it's clearly designed to make people feel afraid, to make them think that things are out of control and that we need strong measures to get things back on track.
Right, right. So it's a very different strategy than what we saw in the 1968 platform, where they seem more concerned with actually trying to address the underlying problems.
Exactly. And it's not just the language. The whole approach to law and order is totally different. It's less about understanding the complexities and more about, drawing a hard line, good guys versus bad guys.
And we got to get rid of the bad guys, right?
Pretty much.
It's interesting, though, because this whole idea of us versus them, this othering, it pops up in other parts of the 2024 platform, too, right? Like when they were talking about fighting left-wing propaganda in schools, it's like they're trying to create a sense of fear and division, like we need to pick a side.
That's a really important point. And yeah, it does make you wonder if this kind of rhetoric is a completely new thing or if it has roots in earlier periods.
Right. Like, were there hints of it back in 1968, maybe in a more subtle form?
That's a really interesting question. It's possible.
It's kind of scary to think about how a conversation about complex issues, even one that tries to be nuanced and thoughtful,
Hmm.
can turn into something much more divisive and dangerous over time.
It definitely makes you think about the power of language and how it can be used to shape people's perceptions and even manipulate their fears.
Which leads us to the question, if this trend continues, where will it take us? I mean, what will these platforms look like in another 50 years if this kind of rhetoric keeps escalating?
That's the big question. But for now, let's get back to these platforms. We've talked a lot about how they view the issues, but what about their underlying philosophies? Like, what about their stance on the role of government? That's another area where we see a huge shift between 1968 and 2024.
Good point. Their approach to the role of government is super important. I'm
Yeah.
curious to see how much it's changed. So we've talked about how these platforms approach the big issues, but I'm really curious about the bigger picture here. Like, how do they see the role of government? What should it be doing or not doing?
Yeah, that's where we see a pretty fascinating evolution. In 1968, they really believed that the government had the power and even the duty to fix social problems. Remember that whole vigorous effort nationwide thing?
Yeah, it's like they actually thought the government could make a real difference.
Exactly. They saw the government as a force for good, leading the charge towards a fairer society. Fast forward to 2024, and, well, things are a little different now.
I bet. So less government action and more.
Oh.
What?
Yeah.
Individual responsibility.
Basically, the 2024 platform is all about slashing regulations, cutting taxes, and unleashing the power of the free market. It's your classic small government message. Less interference, more freedom.
So it's less about we're all in this together and more about you're on your own.
Pretty much. In 2024, the government's not seen as a helpful force so much as it is, well, kind of nuisance. Like they think it's holding people back.
Wow, what a change. Makes you wonder if this shift is a reflection of what people actually wanted or just, I don't know, political strategy.
Probably a mix of both, to be honest. You have to remember, these platforms are products of their time. They reflect what's going on in society, what people are worried about. So in 1968, with the civil rights movement and Vietnam War going on, people were looking to the government for solutions. But in 2024, well, maybe there's a sense that the government's gotten too big, too powerful, or maybe it's just that people feel like things aren't working and they're looking for a different approach.
Right, right. So these platforms aren't just about policy. They're like little windows into the American mind at different points in history.
Exactly. They show us what people were afraid of, what they hoped for, how they viewed the world around them.
It's amazing to see how much has changed and how much hasn't when you look at these two platforms side by side. So as we wrap things up here, what's the biggest takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with?
I think the most important thing is to be critical. Don't just take what you hear at face value, whether it's from a politician or a platform or even, well, a podcast. Do your own research, look at things from different angles, and figure out what you believe.
Love that. Be your own fact checker.
Exactly.
It's been an incredible journey exploring these two platforms. We've covered everything from social programs and law and order to the role of government and even what it means to be American.
It really shows you how much the political landscape can change over time and how important it is to stay engaged, to keep asking questions, and to never stop learning.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive. We'll leave you to ponder these evolving visions of America. Until next